Good afternoon. It's time. This is the Netconf working group meeting. If you're in the wrong room, this is a good time to exit. Let's see. That's kind of strange. Here's the Notewell statement. Anything you say or discuss in the working groups has to follow the guidelines stated in the Notewell. So while you are speaking and on the mic, make sure that you do state your name clearly enough for people to know who you are and for people who are taking notes. Of course, speak into the mic. The blue sheets have been handed out. Make sure that you have entered your name. JavaScribe. We do need a JavaScriber. Our default JavaScriber is unavailable today. So
does anybody have Jabber installed on their computers? Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
All right, thanks, Rishad. There is a link to the Etherpad. Would love people to comment in Etherpad, and we can take that as minutes. So, status of group items since London. We have a bunch of drafts, actually. Okay, so starting with Zero Touch, it's already passed last call. It's right now waiting on Shepard's write-up. That's me to do the write-up for Zero Touch. The Netconf, RESTconf, client-server suite of drafts are kind of work in progress. The Yang push suite of drafts, which I guess we'll also discuss today, are also work in progress. The NMDA suite of drafts, and that include 7895 biz, NMDA Netconf, RESTconf, are already in ISG publication queue, and the UDP pub channel is still work in progress. Anything else you want to? Here's the agenda for today for chartered items. We have Eric and Alex talking about the updates to Yang push and their related drafts, followed by Ken, that he'll talk about the status of client-server drafts and issues therein. And the last item on the chartered item is about UDP-based publication channels. That will be followed by non-chartered items, and we have a few of those. I won't necessarily go through the names. But
just one modification. Lada's not here to present his, so Rob Wilton will be presenting instead of Lada.
Okay. So with that, we can get started. And we have Eric.
Also, another speaker, Rashad, who's going to be doing RESTconf drafts. He's been doing some implementation stuff. I figured introduce him to the group and let him talk about the last two drafts.
You want to give him that clicker?
All right, Alex is currently on a plane out here. Alex is currently on a plane. He's going to be here tonight, but you've seen his messages or comments on the list. I'll be trying to do my best to give you an update from us and from what's been going on in the list. Let's go on. Now, we've been in working group last call started a little while ago for the 3 drafts that we're trying to push as the first set from the overall suite of drafts. That includes the custom subscription to event streams, the Yang data store subscriptions, and the Netconf support. The session here is going to be talking about a couple of the drafts that are not yet ready for completion, and that's the RESTconf stuff, as well as the notification headers and bundles. That's also part of the suite of drafts. Walker is going to be talking about the UDP stuff a little bit later. And there's also a bunch of other items, including Igor's work, that goes into this whole bundle of stuff. But a lot of the items are dependent on the first 3 drafts, or the first 2 drafts at least, for getting the base infrastructure for subscriptions nailed down and closed. And that's what we've been trying to accomplish with a lot of the mails that you've seen on the mailing list. Now, to give some context, we did start on this stuff about in 2014 across IETF and Netconf. In the time since we started, there's been some parallel industry work going, specifically with OC telemetry.yang and GNMI, and the other efforts have progressed, and the real pressure at this point is to complete the work so that we're able to provide something to the industry, so that the implementations don't go all other paths because we're not able to close. And that's one of the things we have to recognize, that there is a window of relevance. Ballas had a message just, I guess it started last week, Yang Push Now, trying to say that there is a window for closing some of these specs. If we want to hit relevance for a subset of the drafts, there are new drafts over in the Yang Push side, such as the Comey stuff that Hank is talking about, which maybe does have a longer time window for relevance, but there's still a desire to get the basic infrastructure going, so those other drafts can build upon it. In terms of changes with working group call lists so far, there have been a number of comments. Real heads up and thanks to Martin and Ken for doing a lot of the heavy pushing on the comments here. There's been a lot of good interactions. Things that have been changed is we've removed receiver address. I know there's been some comments back and forth from a number of people whether that's appropriate, but I think we did settle down on removing address from the common model and putting all the transport specific parameters in the transport draft. We added a very small update for replay previous event time to make the loss discovery easier for a new subscription started. For configured subscriptions, we did some minor renaming of event counters. DSCP became an optional feature at last working group, and there's been other wording tweaks. There's one open mechanism, which I'm hoping to talk about next slide, and that is, do we have support for configured subscriptions and replay? And we'll be talking about that one on our next slide. We're hoping to get an answer for that here. The basic issue is this: for configured subscriptions, there is a need to figure out when that subscription started because it continues to reboot. What do you do? Do you do it at the reboot time? Do you figure it at the time when the transport session comes up? And in terms of the apps that I've been seeing, a lot of them dealing with security, really if they want replay, they want to replay from the point where the boot is going. And the thread we've had is really, do we really need a configured subscription capability? What do we do if we don't have that capability in here? So at least for some places, there are classes of applications which do need a start point which is nailed down a particular time. The only time we can nail down with configured really is the boot time. So without any, so let's take a look and close on feedback here if we want to do this, or if we just want to remove configured subscriptions for replay out. So the two options, if you've been following the list, is do we support replay for configured subscriptions? That's in the current draft. Or do we not support configured replay? And this does have the advantage of having one less feature, but there's a lot of downsides to it in terms of delaying of processing, doing a new dynamic subscription to pull the features from the beginning of the log. There is requirements on the receiver that must be supported. And also importantly, if you have 4 or 5 receivers, if you're trying to get the same set of events, there's no way to time it so the events start from the same period. So I guess the first question to ask you guys, see if we can get feedback and hopefully close this one way or another, is an option to determine whether we support configured replay or whether we don't. And either way is fine. Some of us prefer option 1, but I don't know how you want to do the vote or just do it that way, but let's start out with that particular topic.
So first off, is everyone clear about what the issue is?
Do you have another slide with those hum options, or?
No, this is
okay.
Yeah. Okay, so just a recap. Sorry.
Hi, just this is Hank. Just a clarifying question.
Sure.
There is a replay feature for streams already for notification. Yes, they have a history. So in theory, the mechanics to do some kind of replay are already in place. Then not applied to the data store option, they are available for the stream option, correct?
This is for the stream option.
This is for the stream option.
Do we have replay on a configured subscription for a stream?
But as I'm new to this domain, so there is a kind of history replay already in there somewhere, right?
You have to create a dynamic subscription in order to get it. And even then, how do you know when to start the dynamic subscription?
Oh, okay. That
So
would
the top one
yeah.
is it started at boot. Bottom one has you have a bunch of features, and when you boot up, you have to create lots of dynamic subscriptions in order to do replays from the client.
Yeah, then, okay. Then I'm pretty sure I know what I want now. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, Ashland Ericsson. Actually, in our practice, the major point of replay is not reboot of the network node, but the loss of network connection. And that loss of network connection would be individual to each of the receivers. So it would become a bit complicated. So I like option 2 for that reason.
So actually, that's a good lead-in. If I understand, if a loss of connection would require another subscription started notification, right?
It could, yes.
It would, right? And currently, it is the case that the client would have to do a dynamic. The draft says the client should do a dynamic subscription to fill in any gaps.
That is correct.
So already there's this function or requirement for clients to do that. So this is just a special case of when the box is rebooted and it's starting its configured subscriptions. Do we ask the clients to do a dynamic subscription then to fill in the gaps, or do we just automatically start sending in all the logs that have been created since the boot time? So that's,
Agreed.
yeah, okay.
So that's the basic issue is either you start it with the boot or you go ahead and request the receivers to create a dynamic subscription, how many there are at boot time, all which come in at the same time.
Okay, perfect. So let's just get a show of hands for these two options. So of all those in favor of option number 1, raise your hand, please. All, okay, and then all those in favor of option 2, please raise your hand. It's split. Author's choice, I guess.
All right, option 1. I mean, it just closes it. It provides a feature. All right. From there, Yang push, there really only been minor review comments based on this, so there's not really much work at all to be reporting on that. So the working group last call for Yang push, as far as we know, the comments are closed. All right, so the more interesting draft comes down to the Netconf event notifications. In other words, the transport draft for Netconf. We've had a number of wording updates. We've changed some examples, but the most interesting discussion since last go around was a proposed Yang augmentation for call home to the IETF Netconf server.yang drafts, which we'll be hearing about later. Now, the question of when to do that augmentation is relevant here. As we know, we need some Yang push now type stuff. Do we wait for the configured subscription support in order to close one or more of the drafts? And so the real question that is the unresolved question that is the big one to hopefully close the set of drafts out is the question of, do we progress only the dynamic subscription requirements through last call, or hold off for a biz once the Netconf server Yang supports, or do we just finish our current slide drafts, or do we go ahead and refactor all the work back through the original drafts of Yang push and configured subscriptions to totally separate out configured subscriptions there? That's the big question for the group. And so the question that I'm trying to expose here is that the need for a transport draft for Netconf does close the question needed now of do we support the current version of Netconf event notifications or a variation where the Netconf event notifications just supports configured dynamic subscriptions. So that's the main issue. I'm going to try to open the issues up on the next slide, and that'll be the next vote. So Yang push now thread, how do we get to closure? There's really 3 options. The first option is the 3 current drafts provide dynamic and configured together. We can be done. I mean, as Jürgen pointed out on the thread, it's better to have 80% than 120%. The authors definitely believe that the 4 years of work that we've done so far get us to a reasonable and implementable set of features. And it's matching as best as we could to the charter of having both configured subscriptions and dynamic together with support for different transports. So that's the author's preferred option. There's an option 2, which is dynamic and configured subscriptions together, which includes the current subscribe notification and Yang push without changes, but also then an update of Netconf notifications that just supports dynamic subscriptions. There was a thread with Kent and I where we divided up what that would actually mean. And there's an open question of, is it a support of this viable now, as well as support of enhancements to Netconf notif when IETF Netconf server completes. So it's not a really big change to have a Netconf only dynamic subscription draft. The authors believe that would be a fairly minimal time delta, and it would be okay to make the kind of changes that we had tracked with Kent a few weeks ago. The last question is, do we hold configured subscriptions off after dynamic subscribe notifications and Yang push? We authors, and you might have seen it in Alex's comment, really do not believe that is the right path, mostly because the Yang model and the documents are so intertwined after 4 years of work that it would be extremely difficult to tease apart these elements, and it would require refactoring the Yang model and all the text in those first drafts. So based on that, and based on the fact that we're at the very end, we strongly recommend against that, and probably would be looking for different authors who'd be willing to complete the work if we are willing to go down the step of A3, just because we just believe it's at the market time in fact got to close. So the last I think thing we have to hear now is if people have a choice of the first one, which is done, the second one, which is, can we make a change with just a transport draft supporting the dynamic, or the last one where somebody wants to go ahead and do the work of building a set of drafts which just support dynamic. Thoughts?
Again, a clarifying question. I'm Hank. I just looked it up. So the milestone says September 18 for start of working group last call. So is this dependent on being working group last call completed? That could be a long time, and it says minimal data, and the milestone does not, it looks encouraging with respect to minimal time data.
Yeah, so Mahesh and I modified the milestones recently. Our thinking was that that September milestone would be for the A3 option. Surprised to hear it might take longer. The idea was it could take less time. If we do the A1 option, so I know that from a drafts perspective, it looks kind of done, but still there's things in flux, and especially with the notif, and there's still discussions. There may be a dependency on the client server drafts, which could actually push out when it could become RFCs. So I don't know. So this, to answer your question, September was thinking A3, but it's try not to hold us to that exactly. It's right. we need to do the right work, and it's going to take as long as it takes.
And I think A3 would require new authors. So A3 would require somebody to go ahead and raise their hand and do it.
Yeah. So at A2, so there was a comment about it, whether or not it's viable, and I do want to sort of touch on that because I'm not sure if we can actually do A2. If I understand it correctly, the idea would be that the subscribe notifications Yang would have config true nodes. You could configure a subscription, you can configure a list of receivers, and then when you get down to a receiver, all you would have is its name. There's no actual configuring if it's netconf or restconf or what IP address, what port number, what security parameters, nothing. It's just that. So it's really not what are you configuring exactly? Where's the interoperability to it? If you were to try to have what's the protocol? So I think A2 I can understand from an implementation it could be done, but from a standards perspective, I'm not sure how it would be interoperable. I do question if A2 is viable. Does anybody disagree?
I can give an example of where there are certainly vendor implementations that talk about other types of transports. So if you want to have a single subscription model and use a vendor augmented transport node, then it makes it quite direct to have the basic receiver with vendor augmentations for other transports. So there are values in having the name for use for implementations beyond IETF.
Is there anything on Jabber? No. So what do you think probably do?
I mean, we could try to vote for it. But,
Okay, so back to, again, the goal of this is to try to get something to RFC status faster. A1, it says done, but I think that, again, there could be dependencies that would drag it out into when it would get to RFC status until, potentially, later, right? So, but if A3 is, here the authors are suggesting that they're going to walk away, then that's not going to get done faster unless someone wants to raise their hand and try to do A3. Is anybody willing to pick up the pen for doing A3, option A3? No hands raising. So then A3 is not going to be faster.
right.
So, and A2 I don't think is viable. And all we're left with is A1. So there's no need to do a vote.
It's fine with me.
But it will take longer. Be aware.
Understood.
Okay.
All right, next or actually next question is, do we progress subscribe notifications and Yang push together? I don't know if we still need this hum. We can still ask about it because I thought that there might have been some closure of this offline, or do we still want to have it?
There may have been a misunderstanding. Hank told me that he didn't actually mean, he didn't actually mean to suggest that we could do Yang push as a separate. So it doesn't actually improve. It doesn't make things go faster either, does it?
I don't think it does, no.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think we need to do a hum on that.
All right, which passes us back to the RESTconf notice, so I'll pass it off to Rashad, and he'll update us where they are there.
Let's make sure we record that. We recorded it.
Hi, my name is Rashad Rahman. I'm going to give you an update on the RESTconf transport draft. So here you see the changes from revision 4 to revision 6. One of the first set of changes was error mechanisms to match the embedded RESTconf mechanisms. That, I believe, is section 3.3 in the latest draft. The document was also restructured a fair bit. If you do a diff between 04 and 06, there's quite a bit of restructuring. Yang data model was added for HTTP specific parameters. That, I believe, is the URI for the subscription. And the examples were changed. And the examples which are in the RESTconf transport doc now mirror the ones in the Netconf transport draft. Upcoming changes for Rev 7. There's been discussions on the list regarding using a leaf ref for the for call home to the RESTconf server. So that's your draft, I believe. That's a dependency, and I don't believe there is anything else which is committed for the next revision for now, pending further discussions. The last bullet says when last call. Actually, it should not be when last call. It should most likely be what is needed to go to working group last call. So I think the fact that, well, yes. So that's a question to the chairs and to the room. I mean, I don't know how much attention people have paid to that specific draft because I know the 3 others have been getting way more love.
There are a couple of interesting questions that were raised in the last week. Starting up another thread, you can look for them, but I do think things are needed. For example, how do we get the RESTconf call home in? Do we actually have a linkage for direct connection without having to call home from the publisher to the receiver? So there's 1 or 2 tech questions, and once we can resolve them, then we're ready. But I think between us, we can come up with a list of open questions that need to be resolved, and we're happy to socialize them on the list.
So that's a discussion whether to use SSE or call home, or that what's your
I think the issue is the call home. Do you want a direct connection, or do you want to go back to something else to inject a connection back? And that was Andy's point on, do we just go ahead and call home and drive a dynamic subscription back? So I don't think that's nailed down, and that still has to be worked through on the list.
Okay. Yeah. So So I posted to the list a couple times. I think that the notif drafts we might need more of them, right? I mean, and some of these comments are to the Netconf transport as well. But I mean, there's a notion of is the server going to send the messages using Netconf as a Netconf client or as a Netconf server using call home? Same for RESTconf and or maybe just HTTP2 too, right? Or and I know HTTP2 is part of RESTconf, but I think it could be its own thing, its own protocol.
It could definitely. I don't think that the Netconf has the same issues that RESTconf does, because in Netconf, there's only the Netconf client has to be the originator. In terms of the HTTP2 subscriptions, just like gRPC, often the client server is always unidirectional. So the idea of the client being the publisher for HTTP2 does make it different than if something's being originated from the RESTconf side. So the interplay of client and server flopping back and forth for the different roles is something that's been out there for a while, but I don't think we've had sufficient working group review of all the implications there. One good implication that we have to nail down is SSE. SSE is needed for HTTP 1.1, and that's what Andy has right now with the RESTconf, and the other authors have with the RESTconf draft. However, you don't really need SSE with HTTP 2 because of the way it works. And how do we go ahead and deal with the legacy support? Do we just have legacy support of SSE for dynamic subscriptions? What do we do about configured? Those are some of the scope elements that have been sitting there for a while but never really got completed by the group.
I'm not sure if I understood what you were saying about the RESTconf client server. As I understood that there was a lot of concerns about, well, like for instance with Netconf, how there's a hello exchange, and it'd be unusual for just the server to start pushing messages without some sort of RPC to kick it off. So I think there was some. Is that what you're talking about?
I don't think that actually is the case on the HTTP2 side. There's plenty of times HTTP2 can just stream to the other side, because you have the need to do a push and have to get a response back that your push is working. There is a means with configured subscriptions to do effectively an OK that it's ready to receive information before you push the updates. It's in the draft, but we can talk about it further. The real question is, how do we link the existing client server model for publisher push for where there's no RESTconf involved into a receiver side that can signal back that, yes, I'm ready to receive this info. And there's a simple modeling there for how it works now. And we've got to make sure that we link in what you've built in the RESTconf model with the handling of the certificates and the rest of this. And that's really the key, isn't that we have an interaction model, but it matches cleanly to the stuff that you're trying to do with the credentials for the security parameters.
So, I mean, my thoughts are that the notif drafts are going to go quickly. I mean, once we sort of nail down the strategy that we're applying for trying to.
You're talking about the 3 drafts which are in last call?
No, in general, you're talking about the RESTconf notif draft, but I'm trying to say in general, the notif drafts are going to go quickly. They're going to follow a pattern. There's a sort of a template, and they're all going to augment into the subscribe notifications model and do something. So if you're bringing in here it says IETF RESTconf server, that would be with call home, but there could be another draft which is using IETF RESTconf client, right? So it's basically also pushing using RESTconf but as a client. And so are those would be 2 different notif strategies. They'd be, and likewise you could do the same thing with Netconf. So Mike, going back to sort of Eric's previous conversation with the options A1, A2, A3. The question is, with A2, I said I didn't think it was viable, right? And so you're in that list of receivers and you're trying to configure a receiver and all there is a name. Like, should there be, for instance, a choice mandatory true? Like, you actually have to pick something. Like, the server may support a number of different notif transports, and they're all augmenting the model. And when you're configuring the subscription, you have to pick one. And then this sort of the follow-on question: is there a mandatory to implement transport? Currently, there's no notion of there being a mandatory to implement transport. So what is it going to be? Is it going to be Netconf? Is it going to be RESTconf? Is it going to be something else? Do we SSE, for instance?
In general, I think that RESTconf and Netconf are independent, and if you have chosen one transport, you've chosen the transport. So mandatory to implement really, to me, is a choice of the transport model underneath. If you've chosen one, then it works. In terms of the Netconf draft, I do think that, from my perspective, no more changes are needed. We want to augment in the call home when that's ready, but I do see that as in a fairly good place. But I do agree that the RESTconf and other models, other transports will need their own draft, like you're saying.
We're out of time, I think.
Yeah, we are.
Right.
So that's the next draft. No change, so that's fairly quick.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to bring up my slides. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'll be presenting the client server-side drafts. So just very quickly, we adopted the cryptotypes and trust anchor drafts. We did not unadopt the key store draft. All drafts have been updated and submitted as a set, but we do have some open issues lingering, which we'll be going over right now. Just also, here's the relationship between all the different drafts. I'm not going to spend any more time on this, but we can go back to the slide if necessary. Okay, so the first issue is, should we keep trust anchor separate from key store? So again, originally we just had IETF key store, which had both the keys and the trust anchors. But then we created trust anchors as a separate draft in an attempt to get rid of key store, but we wound up keeping key store in the end, and yet trust anchors remain separate. So the question is now, do we actually keep them separate or bring them together? Trade-offs of keeping them separate provides more applicable names, so key store just stores keys, and provides some modularity. For instance, the drafts can be updated independently, but bringing them together would be one less module to deal with. So the options are 1 and 2, keeping separate or as they are, or bringing together. So I'm just very quickly raising hands.
Right. So, sorry, a comment.
Yes, sorry. This is my TCG, the Trusted Computing Group hat on. Terminology in the Trusted Computing Group differentiates between root of trust and shielded location, which is basically the store and the key, the anchor, sorry. So they deliberately divided those terms and did not call them a shielded secret. It would be both, for example, but it's about a shielded location, about the capabilities a root of trust provides. So maybe this is the same separation here.
Okay, so
but there's precedence for the division.
Okay, great. Okay, good.
All right, so I guess that rules for option 1 unless someone objects. Okay. Option 1, keep the module separate. Show of hands. I agree. All right. Anybody for option number 2? Okay. That's option number 1.
Okay, next, keep the local or key store keys. So there's a grouping, and in the grouping there's a choice called local or key store, which came from wanting to have application-specific keys. Balazs, this was your comment, where keys that are not shared for any other purpose. And the choice statement accurately configures single-use keys, but it makes for rather busy models. If you looked at them, they're kind of busy looking. But when you made that comment, this is what I thought would make sense, but it occurred to me after the fact that an alternative could have been to instead have all the keys in the key store and just let the application, the operator, deal with ensuring that some keys are only used once. They're not referenced more than once. So do we stick with option 1 as it is, having this construct local or key store choice, or eliminate the local option and just have all the keys in the key store and let the operator deal with it?
Any comments before we?
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So what's your preference? I think for all these issues, it's useful to understand as an author what your preference is. Do you have a leaning, or if you don't care either way?
I'd probably just keep the current, less work, but I don't care.
Balazs and yeah, Ericsson. I foresee also an option that you just put an if feature also on the local branch, and then you can choose that. In my implementation, it's always a central key store. I would prefer that, actually.
Okay, so the next slide is actually touching on that. I'm not sure if it's possible, Balazs, to do that. The next slide goes into that. Perhaps we should look
Okay.
at the next slide then.
Okay, let's
Because
just
it
do
might
that and then
change
come
much.
back.
Yes, we can come back to this one. Okay, so assuming we do the local and key store choice, we keep it. How to disable the support for the local choice? This is what Balazs was just saying. So we could, already there's a feature called key store implemented. And, so for those who don't want to implement key store, they don't have to, they could just have all the keys be local. And so we could have if defined not key store implemented, which then would do it. But that would be a global on-off switch, right? So whether or not the server implements key store, it's a global selection. It wouldn't be per use of the grouping. So you couldn't have some keys be in the key store and other keys not in the key store, just one or the other. Option 2 is really the same as option 1, but instead of doing the not key store implemented, you create something called local key supported or something like that. But it's a global on-off switch. It's not per use. We could do nothing to these grouping definitions and let the downstream modules augment in their own if feature statements. So that would be a per use switch, which is good. But the immediate use of these would be the SSH and TLS client server drafts, because those drafts are using these groupings, and then those drafts would want to augment in the if feature. So what feature are they augmenting in? And it looks almost like a global selection at that point. And then option 4 would be don't attempt to disable local choice at all. Just it's always available, so it's not what you want. But so that's the rationale behind why. And for this one, to Rob's point, I do have a preference. I think option 4 is probably the better. We don't try to limit it. But what do you think?
Sorry, I would be happy with 1 or 2 actually, but if you take 1 or 2, yeah, you can support or not support the action relevantly, and then you end up with option 4 if you set the feature accordingly.
Okay, so a global switch would be okay for you? Yeah,
Simple, easy.
it is easy. All right, so then back to the previous slide. I guess that means we do want to keep the local or key store choice construct. That would be option 1. And then for this slide, we can add in a not key store implemented if feature statement. 1. Do you want it 1 or 2?
2.
Okay.
To the mic. So Balazs votes for.
I would like to, because it's really what I want to say. I don't want local keys. That's my feature.
Okay. All right, next, should some of KeyStore's groupings be moved to cryptotypes? So at the top of the slide, you see that there's 5 groupings listed that are not KeyStore specific. And then there are 3 groupings that are KeyStore specific, meaning actually by their namesake, you can see that these are the ones that have a leaf ref to KeyStore. So they depend on the existence of KeyStore. So this one is for those 5 groupings that aren't KeyStore specific. Should we just move them into the crypto types module? You would think it'd be definitely would want to do that, but I think it's a little bit unusual to put groupings into types modules. If you look at Yang types or IANA types, you don't really have groupings in them. So it might be just a little bit unusual from that perspective. Also note these groupings, the ones with asterisks, they actually have an inline notification statement. So again, it's a little bit more than what you normally have in a types module. So option 1 is to move these 5 groupings into the crypto types module, and then option 2 is to keep them in the key store. Anybody have any preferences for these? Okay, this one I think I might take to the list actually, because there's probably some, like maybe after we try to look at it some more, it'll make more sense. Okay, next, should algorithm identities be moved from the SSH TLS common modules to the crypto types module? Now, this one's actually, we don't have any solutions for this currently, so it's kind of an open discussion. The uses for these identities are to define algorithms and their key definitions, whether they're, it doesn't matter if they're local or in the key store. To constrain the allowed key algorithm types. so as to conform to some security policy. So for instance, when you're doing a handshake, TLS handshake, they're a subset of the protocols are being advertised. It's not all of them. So, that's how the identities are used as well. Also to specify a preference for certain key types in the order. That's just what I said. The problem is that we have 3 sets of identities, right? So there's identities that are being defined at the SSH layer, also the TLS layer, and then finally at the key store layer. We have to have them at the key store layer, right? So you're creating a key. What algorithm is the key creating? Is it RSA? Is it elliptical curve? What curve? What's the key length? All that. It has to be there because you're creating the key. But then you're using that key at the protocol layer, and then there's almost a different set of identities. And then how do we bring them together? So I have been in discussion with Frank Huawei, who's into crypto, and also Gary Wu from Cisco. So hopefully, they can help us resolve some of this. But I just want to let you know this is an open issue. I don't have any proposed solutions that we can discuss. But if anyone is anyone familiar with these identities used for keys and things like that? I mean, if anyone is interested in this topic, we could use some help. Okay, that one's going to the list for sure. Next, add a periodic feature enabling the initiating peer to optionally support periodic connections. So this is in the client server drafts, and when making the connection, whether you're acting as a client or call home, it doesn't really matter. It's are you having a persistent connection, or is it more of a periodic connection? So I think pretty standard is to have persistent connections, right? I mean, everyone has the default. It's the easier thing to do. Harder is to code for periodic connections, but they're better in a way. They're using less resources and they're actually more secure. So there's benefits. So the trade-off would be, it seems that periodic connections are not commonly implemented. A feature would primarily be to accommodate that market trend, right? Just dealing with reality in a way. Periodic connections are incredibly useful, but by not having a feature, we might nudge the industry into supporting them more, right? So do we add the periodic feature and say that the periodicity may be implemented, or we don't add it and then it must be implemented?
Comments?
Rob Wilson, Cisco, I would prefer option 1 and let the industry decide.
Good. And I see some other heads nodding to that, so I think option 1 is good. Thank you. Next and last, I think, add support for TCP keep alives. So there was a discussion with some folks from the BDF who are interested in this. So the Netconf, RESTconf client server modules currently support configuring keep alives, but those keep alives are assumed to be happening at the crypto layer level, right? So SSH-based keep alives or TLS level keep alives. It turns out that TLS keep alives aren't well supported in TLS libraries. So OpenSSL doesn't implement them currently. In fact, they were implementing them, but then they, because they had a security issue, they are trying to take it out, and there's a discussion. There's a budding IETF statement, I think some of you saw it, that says that when using a crypto transport, the aliveness checks should not occur via the underlying clear text protocol, right? That actually it introduces a problem of sorts. So there's that should not, right? But here's the configuration model. So what should the configuration model do? Question 1, do nothing and only support crypto level keep alives, or do something to also support TCP keep alives. Okay, so we'll just do question 1 before we go to question 2.
Any comments? Okay.
Tim Carey, Nokia. So we brought this up from the Broadband Forum, and so they're looking at persistent connections that they need to keep that through firewalls and proxies. They have to keep that up, and right now they've got the keep alives going for it. What they need to have is a way of configuring that so that they can, through these persistent connections, so they can manage those keep alives, both from the client to server, server to client, right? The domains, many of the domains that they have are in secured areas, some are not. So if you don't do, they have to have keep alives. TLS doesn't work because of the support, as noted. So the option would be to do this here or do it up at the Netconf layer. And by the way, then that says that we do it at the RESTconf layer, right? Because it's at the protocol layer. Or you allow for both. I know that right now they are planning on using these modules, and even if they have to augment for the TCP keep alives, they'll do that at their layer. But they would prefer to see them in the original drafts, even if it's featured out. You know that you can do it as a May. So that's where they're at right now. But they're looking for some guidance.
Right.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson, our management system people actually prefer Netconf level keep alive, so I don't see that as important for us.
Netconf level keep
Yes.
alives. Okay.
And we have some configurations for that, which, yeah, it's a simple timer which could be included in the Netconf server, but yeah, we can do it without the standard.
So again, Tim Carey, so I don't think they care if it's at the protocol layer, so long as it's at both protocol layers.
Okay.
And it's both ways that we do this, that you allow for these configurations. And again, they can just augment out the TCP keep alives in the short term, waiting for the drafts to show up if that's necessary.
Yeah, and one follow-up regarding the implementations, like OpenSSL implementing it. Part of the discussion we're having with the TLS ADs and the transport area ADs is to have an IETF level statement that we can then take back to the OpenSSL community and say, look, here it is. You guys really should support TLS level keep alives and hopefully get that implemented. But how quickly would that happen? It may not be within your timeframe. Okay, so again, currently in the models, there is a keep alive, right? It's optionally configured, and if you do configure it, so that so like how often do you send the keep alives? How many failed responses? What's the delay? Those kinds of parameters. And it just simply says keep alives. It doesn't say, SSH keep alives or TLS keep alives. It just says keep alives. So it's kind of neutral as to what kind of keep alives it is. So I don't really think it would be okay. I mean, I think we'd need to strengthen the interpretation, right? From the interoperability perspective, if it's unclear now, we probably need to make it clear that we're definitely talking about it being the crypto layer keep alives. Right. But I think to your point, and I'm fearful of doing TCP keep alives for the security risk, but if you like the protocol level keep alives, we might be able to add that, and then that would resolve this issue as well.
Yeah, so look, we've done management protocols forever, right? And every management protocol has a keep alive mechanism in place, usually at the protocol layer, right? And so that's probably the preferred approach to do this, from both ways. But there's also, I think when you look at the draft, there's some attributions, just some leafs that probably are missing, because you got the intervals and blah, blah, blah. There's like 2 or 3 attributes that need to be placed in there. Again, whether it's at the protocol would be preferred, the TCP, if they need it, that they can augment it. And right now, because of the time frame that it takes to get this stuff through IETF, frankly, they're going to augment the thing and waiting for the drafts anyway, right?
Well, okay, so my concern, and why I'm bringing this to the working group, is that I was concerned that we might try to configure something which is actually not recommended from an IETF perspective. But, and that would be the TCP keep alives. But I think it's definitely recommended to do protocol level keep alives, and we should actually add something so we have whoever's doing the configuration can choose. Do they want crypto level keep alives, or do they want protocol level keep alives? We can do that.
And if you do that, just make sure you feature them, because put a feature in there such that the people that may very well be going along the world for TCP keep alives can use that, and they don't have to have the baggage of the of the application protocol keep alives that go through there. So there could be a time so the problem is that there's going to be a time where they may very well have a TCP keep alives in place, right? Or a protocol level keep alive in place that they're not going to want the one that's out of the standard. So just make sure that some sort of a may on it, right?
Okay.
That they can feature it.
Okay. So I think we can work with this. So we don't really need to look at option, the second part. And I think that's it. Great, thank you. Is it Tim?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Guang Zheng from Huawei. Yeah, this draft is about the UDP-based publishing channel. And last IETF we not do the presentation because we not there's not so many discussed in the Middle East. This time we discussed some issues and comments in the Middle East, and we updated the draft. And because there's not do presentation so many times, so we reintroduce the document and for the UDP here for UDP publishing channel to US TCP for like the over Netconf or RESTconf or gRPC. And here data collector will suffer now currently suffer a lot of TCP connection from many line cards encrypted on different devices for the distributed devices, and as no connections data needs to be maintained. So UDP encapsulation can be easily implemented by the hardware, some chips, which will further improve the performance. And because of the lightweight UDP encapsulation, high frequency and better transit performance can be achieved, which is important for the stream telemetry. And a new UDP-based publication channel we have promoted here, and, which facilitates the distributed data collection mechanism. For directly push data from the line cards on many devices to a collector, and support multiple encoding, including binary and or for XML, JSON, yeah, and adapting to the subscriber notification and YAM push, and enable some option for the extensibility. Here is the transport mechanism. This time we updated to the draft. And here have two main mechanisms. One is the dynamic subscription and the configured subscription. Here we have two rules for collector and publisher. And for the dynamic, like the subscriber notifications, first establish the subscription, then after the confirm reply to the established subscription, then send the notifications from multi-line cards by the UDP. And the collector can modify the subscription by the control tunnel to the publisher. After the modified success, the publisher will update the filter and maybe some new subscription and send it. And it can delete it from the collector to the publisher to delete the subscription. Then the multi-line card will terminate the subscription. This is for the dynamic subscription. And for the configured subscription, similarly, there is a capability exchange for the web supported and can establish by the configuration edit configure to configure the subscription. Then the publisher will send the notification by the configuration itself. Yeah. Here for the transport for the message for the UDP public channel for the layer. This time we add the security layer for with the DTLS over the UDP, and for DTLS, it provides the reusable security and authentication function over UDP. And for the message header here, some important information before the deserializing the notification, like the encoding method for GPB, COBOL, maybe some others. And for the message generator ID, for the line cards, and for the sequence number, and with the support of fragmentation, and some other options for extensibility. And for the notification message, it includes a notification header as defined in another draft for notification messages, which just now Eric have introduced and encoded with the content. Here is the diff format of the UDP publishing channel message header. It includes for the version, for the header version, and for the flag, like some options for reliability, fragmentation, and for the encoding type, length, and message generator ID to mark which source comes from, and for the message ID and some other options. Yeah. Any comments?
In the binary encoding drafts, there were a set of comments that is the GPB or encoding trivial, or do we need to document something around that? And at least Andy Bierman stated that it is not trivial, and we do need some documentation around that if you want to use it.
You mean for another document to?
How to encode Yang-defined data in GPB.
Oh, yeah.
I am not an expert, but Andy was very strong that there needs to be a discussion on that.
Okay. Okay, any comments?
Yeah, I have a comment. Kent, as a contributor. So it seems like for configured descriptions, it seems like maybe we should have a notif draft, right? Like it would actually be like a notif, UDP notif, something like this, and it would augment into the receivers list, just like it, right? Have you looked into for configured descriptions?
Yeah.
Augmenting Eric's described notifications draft?
Yeah, I will reference that draft for the configured notification.
Well, in the current draft, there's no Yang module. So I was thinking that maybe there should be a Yang module in here that's augmenting into.
Yeah, augmenting to the subsequent notifications for the Yang model. We will add the UDP.
Oh, you plan to add it?
Yeah. Huh?
You plan to add a Yang module
Yeah.
into this draft?
We in the draft already do the augmentation now. Yeah.
So if you can go up a couple of slides,
Yeah.
go to the diagram.
Okay. So next, we will augment, here we'll augment the SM model and add the UTC configuration, and for the security consideration and other, for other consider and address or maybe other comments,
So go back to your header.
Header, yeah.
Tim Carey, Nokia. Just a real quick question, and I'm just wondering, because I was sitting in on Comey, right?
Yeah.
What you have here,
What, sorry?
I said, what you have here smells and looks a lot like CoAP. And my question is, why do we need another format, header format?
Not a header format, I think, just for the content.
Well, you have a message ID, a version, some flags, right? Or is that the UDP header that's up there, or what? What do you have that's unique?
You mean for the message ID? What's the user for message ID?
An encoding type is not
Coding
unique
type
to this?
only, I think only for the content coding. Here, the header only marks how to encode the notification content itself, not the header. The header will be plain text, I think.
No,
It's
I
plain.
think the question Tim is asking is how is it unique or different from the CoAP draft? Have you looked at the CoAP draft? This-
Yeah, I think maybe not deeply for the code. Maybe I will look at deeply and then discuss again for the code itself.
So my point is they've already gone through this problem. You know, when you start talking about replay, you talk about fragmentation, you talk about acknowledgements, you talk about all that stuff that you have with a protocol. And now we're doing this with the UDP piece, right? And we've already said, and guess what? We're going to use DTLS, right? And I'm like going, I'm not saying use CoAP as a protocol, but I'm
Yeah.
wondering what is necessary that of the things
yeah.
that they haven't thought about or that we haven't thought about that they've already thought about with that co-op header, right? And because I look at the co-op header and I'm seeing there's some things that are distinctly missing,
Okay.
right? And that's all I'm just saying is that I'm not saying implement COMI or co-op. I'm saying that header has got things there for a reason. It's got extensions. It's got the whole bit that you want to do, and it's doing it in a very concise fashion, right? But to me, it would seem like it would be something that maybe you want to make consistent, right? At least for protocol analyzers, for protocol implementers, that type of stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi. Hi.
Yeah.
This is Hank speaking as an IoT director. There's not only the co-op RFC. There are a lot of extensions to it. So some things haven't been addressed in the core co-op draft, of course. And core mean core, not the working group now. And so there are a lot of things like reliable transport via WebSockets, DTLS, as a TLS and something. And there's also like observing resources, having basically a subscription. There's also resilience. There's also finding a home using co-op. It's basically an anima. So I think there are a lot of puzzle pieces that are already there. And what I really would like to know what the gap is that was just been talking about. So if there's actually a gap, where do we fill it?
You mean
Do we
with
fill it here? Or do we incubate something in core? Or is it so Netconf specific that it is natural, intuitive to do it here? So what I would really like to see is the gap, which I'm actually really unaware of. So there might be a lot of gaps.
Yeah.
But we have to look at all the building blocks in core and then what you want to achieve, so your requirements and the solutions here, and then see what the difference is. And having done that, I think we can make a real good decision here. And I don't think that takes so long. Maybe it just takes a lot of people from here talking to core people.
Yeah, maybe we can check after meeting and maybe we can discuss with you. Yeah.
I think cores today
Yeah.
also. Yeah, it's the next meeting. Yeah, I'm doing slides right now. I'm sorry.
Okay. Kent, as a contributor, sort of to add on to Tim and Hank's comments, so we have these client server drafts, and I'm thinking, so Netconf client server and RESTconf client server, I think that we might want to have a co-op client server someday, right? And if there were a co-op client server, then there would be, I think, almost by definition, a co-op notif draft, right? And that co-op notif draft would, augment into the subscribe notifications tree as well. So if you wanted to do a dynamic subscription, the client would start a co-op connection to the co-op server and basically do subscribe notifications over co-op, which would give you the UDP and DTLS and all that. Or if they want to configure subscriptions, they could configure that as well. So sort of, I know we adopted this draft, but I'm actually questioning if this is the right approach. Should we instead be actually just using co-op and have co-op client server drafts and co-op notif and go that route instead? I'm opening up the room and I see Tim walking to a microphone, so.
I think the gentleman, the IoT director, Hank, I think he's got the right approach. If you want to go down that path, do some analysis, because there's a lot of extensions and some overhead with co-op, even with COMI stuff that they're doing, right? I was just noting to say, they solved many of these problems in core, right? For co-op, that you may be missing some things, right? So I think the analysis is, before you go off that ledge, do some analysis to make sure that you're not getting more than what you want to try to do, because he's using UDP here for streaming telemetry things for the primary purposes. Saying, I don't know, that one might be a bigger leap because there's a lot of stuff that goes around co-op, right?
Okay.
So, certainly the protocol header and those fields that might be missing, and it may very well lead to what you're saying. I'm just saying, don't make that decision without the analysis.
Okay.
So one more follow-on comment. A lot of what this draft is about is allowing the notifications to be sent from the line cards themselves, so they don't have to go to the routing engine, for instance, to get sent. How is that configured? Like if you were to like do a dynamic subscription, how do you say that you want it to come from the line cards versus from the routing engine, or if you're doing configured subscription, how do you configure that?
How to configure for multi-line cards, right?
Uh-huh.
I think for the subscription, for the collector, that's mean for the client, for the subscriber, they do not concern whether have multi-line cards, right? Just configure. I need your push to some receiver, give the target, and the system itself will decide whether distributed multi-line card send multi-source. Yeah. So that is for, I think, for whether multi-line cards or not is decided by the system, the server itself. So for the client, no, are not concerned.
So that works for UDP, and but I'm just thinking if we were to do, not that I recommend it, but if we were to have the individual line cards doing TCP based, like Netconf or RESTconf, then they would have to be more aware because there's actually sessions, and they'd have to know,
sessions, right?
yeah, multiple sessions then.
Yeah.
So they'd have to be more aware. I'm just thinking that, I mean, and Eric, in all of your subscribe notifications work, it's always been the assumption that there's just all the even notifications are being funneled into the routing engine, and then like that. So it seems like we need to do something to a flag to say something to help support the multi-line cards.
Yeah, and for multi-line cards, we have another draft. Yes.
Yeah, it's another topic.
Another draft. Yes.
Okay.
Maybe next.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Here is for the for subscription to multi-stream originator. Now is for personal draft. We now is for in the discussion for the use case, and for this draft, I think is from the beginning is. Separated from the UDP telemetry. Yes, we discussed with Erica and Andy and some other guys. Yeah, we think maybe for this scenario, maybe we can define another draft to discuss for the requirement and solution. Yeah, like so maybe RESTconf. Here for the use case, first we begin with the use case. I think SIM for large amount of data collection from devices with the main distributed architecture design, hardware design with the mainboard and line cards, and maybe currently existing solution consider only one public server reside in the mainboard, which result in performance bottleneck for the collector when data are forwarded to the mainboard. Yeah, currently solution is only one connection is there, so multi-line card will send to the mainboard, then send to the collector. So there may be a bottleneck. And for the request our distributed data collection mechanism, which can directly push data from the line cards to a collector, like the RESTconf just now mentioned. Yeah, for the use case too, for here, some cases for the IoT, collector cannot subscribe access data directly from IoT nodes. So subscribe data from the maybe for the border router. Then border router distributes the subscription to the nodes. The IoT nodes stream data to the collector through border router. Then the collector assembles the subscription data like this. And here is initially solution overview. We define the role of the solution for collector publisher. For collector, there's it may be role as for subscriber and receiver here, like the diagram, yeah. And the publisher, they have two roles for master and agent because they're multi-streams, and for subscription server and component subscription server, like in the diagram. And now issues being worked is for subscription decomposition to keep track of resources and associated publisher and make decision on the decomposing the global subscription into multiple component subscription, and for publication composition to compose the component notification into one, because the source may be from multi-stream and subscription elements, some error codes related to the subscription decomposition and the component subscription. And for the notifications on the subscription state changes, each component subscription maintains its own subscription state and is responsible for sending its own OM notifications. And some other potential issues, such as synchronization, service discovery, maybe net, maybe security. Yeah, that is what we are working on. Okay. Yeah.
So, Mahesh, speaking as a contributor, so if I look at the two use cases that you have,
Yeah.
you have a case where you have a single box which is acting as a proxy, which is use case 2, the border router, and you have the other case where it's really the bottleneck, right? So, and the individual line cards are sending the
Oh,
notification.
you mean this is bottleneck, right?
Right. So you have one case where one is a proxy, and the other case where it's not a proxy. The line cards are sending it directly. So the question I have is, to the comment that Kent made, is when you're making a subscription notification, is it for sending it through the proxy, or is it through individual line cards? How is that? How do you resolve that? I mean, what kind of subscription notification would you be sending?
You mean for this for this use case 2?
For either one of the cases.
Yeah, I think for this these two use case scenario maybe not same. For use case 1, for maybe there's the notifications, maybe the size or the traffic is very big. So in this case, for the use case 1, maybe the main board will be bottleneck. But for the IoT, as we know, maybe there's the notification not so many. So maybe the different scenarios.
No, but that's notification. But how about the configuration request itself?
Oh, you mean for configuration, right?
Mm-hmm.
For configuration, I think for the client to subscribe, they do not concern whether it is distributed or centralized for the generator itself, but they know the scenario. Whether they know the scenario, maybe there's a multi-source, multi-generator. So as other for UDP publishing channel, we have the generator ID. Yeah. So and for now we are discussing how to define the YARN model for configure it. Maybe when we configure the subscription, they will the server, the publisher will reply some parameter like to notify the subscriber whether I have multi line cards or not. Maybe they will give some you give a list for generator ID. Yeah, to notify the client I have the multi generator source or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a support for use case 1, I definitely think this is valuable work, and it's been stuff that a number of vendors have been talking about for a year. So whenever you're ready to push for adoption, I'd certainly say yes. I don't know if now's the time or not, but it's certainly useful work. In terms of the configuration versus where the messages come off, we have done a mapping in the past of each individual state change notification and configuration, and it does maps cleanly onto the lines from the subscribe notification draft. So you are able to identify which flows go on which connection, and I can work with him in order to expose that to people as extra information.
Okay.
Okay.
So for use case 1, isn't that what the previous draft, the adopted draft, UDP pub channel, you said when you were doing that presentation that it would be system's choice to just send it through the line cards. So it seems like use case 1 is already solved with that draft.
You mean that UDP public channel solved this case, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think maybe cover the main scenario. Yeah.
I mean, it's already resolved in that other draft, right?
Yeah, I think maybe the main scenario is covered. Yeah, but here maybe the multi-stream may be a different view.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think this proposal is really just for use case number 2 right now. That's how I'm understanding it.
Hello, Miro Vrana from Nokia. I wanted just to ask, because those two use cases seems to be quite different from each other. I still don't understand why do you want to push them in one draft. Can you say what is common between them?
Yeah,
Maybe
this I
stupid
think maybe
question,
for the they have same those keys not same. So but for they have some similar common solution maybe for multi-generator, multi-source like this. Yeah, I think we can discuss after meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you might want to consider both the points that this person from Nokia made and the previous comment with respect to what Kent made isn't this, if this is already solved in your UDP pub channel draft, you may want to actually keep the UDP pub to deal with the distributed sending of notifications and just take this draft just to the
Yeah, use case two.
for the use case 2.
Yeah, we will discuss maybe we have already booked a meeting, internal meeting, design team meeting to discuss further detail about this. Yeah.
Tianran from Huawei, and we use these two use cases to introduce a more general distributed data collecting framework. And for this framework, we can also use TCP-based channel. We can use UDP-based channel, whatever. So here, this is the framework. But for the previous draft, we focus on the UDP-based publication channel. That's a difference, I think.
Not sure if I got that. Let's take this to the list. Is that okay?
It's okay. Yeah.
And you're next. Can you bring up? And if you're supposed to go faster. Good.
All right, I'll talk about binary encoding. Just a quick recap from the London IETF. There were a couple of questions on what is it going to be encoding. Our assertion is that it's simpler to do one switch to a new encoding format and do it for all the operations. That would, of course, include not just edit, get, but get data and notifications. And the secondary question to that was whether we needed to do it just for push notifications or were there other operations that could benefit. So in the case of periodic gets of even a get data or get could benefit from a binary encoded format. But the bigger question is, do we want to play between different encodings for different operations, or do we just switch to one encoding and use it for all the operations? So just to lay it out there. The other question on the list was, is this also relevant for RESTconf? And the question there is, I think Andy responded saying there is already a content type header in HTTP that can be used to specify the encoding format. So maybe the minimum thing that we could agree in this working group is what are the encoding formats we are going to support and register them in a registry in IETF, and RESTconf could use those. So specifically to the issues related to the draft, question, there was a bit of debate in London whether it should include the message layer or should not. The authors, after discussing with Andy and a couple of others, seem to believe that there is a way to switch to a new encoding right after a hello, and that would then include not only Yang data, but also the message layer. On issue number 1, which is support for notifications, if we were to go with that notion that we switch to a new encoding right after hello, any form of notification, whatever this work group finally agrees, not only on 5277, but the new format, could benefit from using the new encoding that is already negotiated on the session. On issue number 3, we had initially indicated in 00 draft that we might have to indicate the actual start of the new encoding. But again, after discussing with Andy and a couple of other authors, we believe that we don't really need an explicit activate operation, that the server will send an unordered list of encodings. The client will indicate its preference with an ordered list, and whichever is the first match is what is going to be picked for the encoding. This is more a question of are those encoding formats going to be registered, so both protocols know which are the supported encoding formats. I guess it's a non-issue in the sense that, yes, we can put it in the registry for the list of encodings we want supported. Next steps are, since there is still discussion, or was discussion at least, coming into this meeting regarding push notifications, once that debate is kind of settled, we can resolve any issues as far as encoding are concerned, whether it's configured or dynamic, and then ask for this draft for workgroup adoption. Questions? All right. If no questions, thanks.
Okay. And Balash, here.
Hello, Balash Angela from Ericsson. I am presenting a draft that you might have seen last time as well, and which is a kind of cutoff from the Yang push effort to make it smaller and faster. So, just to recap, we recognize that even though a publisher may say that he supports on-change notification, for some reasons it might not support on-change notification for every data node, every bit of the model. Typical cases would be because it's just not implemented. It takes time and effort to implement it, especially if you need to fetch it from different parts of the hardware. Or maybe you say that you won't implement it because InOpTest's changing so fast that it was unreasonable and takes too much load to implement it. Or you might just not have the manpower to do all the implementation. In other cases, you might be limited, even though the implementation is there, you might still not be able to send the on-change notifications because you have resource limitations, like some hardware card is not plugged in. Or you might share a common Yang model for big nodes and for constrained small nodes, and they might have different capabilities. So practically, even if I say my node supports on-change notifications, there's no guarantee that any individual single data node will really send notifications, and that's a problem. So the goal of this draft is to document which specific data nodes will send on-change notifications and which data nodes will not. And we want some formal documentation about this. And this documentation needs to be available both online during the life of the node, but also in design time or implementation time, because you want to do an OSS integration. You want to depend on what will be coming out of the node. So you want this information early. And for that reason, the proposal is to define a Yang model that would document which nodes send or do not send the on-change notifications, and then use the Yang instance data draft to document that early in implementation time. And then you can do your OSS integration or OSS development accordingly. Okay, what changed since the last time I presented this? Based on the comments from Martin Björklund, the Yang data model was simplified. It's no longer an augmentation to the IETF Yang library, because then connecting it to the different Yang modules individually would be complicated. It's not augmenting subscribe notifications either, because that doesn't have a single root, which is good to augment, so it's a standalone model. It contains default values. So if your node supports on-change notification for everything, then you have to support just 2 leaves as on-change defaults, and then you're finished. If you have, let's say, some special cases, then you can specify that individually, but because the on-change capability is inherited down the containment model, we believe there will be only a few individual leaves needed. This is the new model. Yeah, it's not a big thing. It's read-only, should be set by the system itself. And this is just an example of how this would look like in an instance data file. Again, there's a wrapper around it, and then it's quite simple. There are some open issues. Should we model the on-change notifications capability separately for the NMDA data stores? And Jürgen Björklund argues strongly for that. Jürgen Schönbader argues strongly for that. On the other hand, I don't see the use case why this would be needed. If someone could tell that, then it would be nice. And the names in the current model are too long, but that's a separate small issue. Yes, they should be made shorter. And I think I would like to request adoption by the work group. It received quite a bit of support from the last IETF meetings. Received some comments and support on the mailing list, and no one objected really. And the problem that we really must know if the on-change notifications are coming or not is a real problem. It's maybe is not a good answer. Any questions?
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So looking at the open config, the way they do this, I think they had an option for subscriptions or telemetry data where the device itself can choose to send the data as quickly as possible. So rather than it's either it can do on-change subscriptions or it can't, it can actually choose what rate, for example. So if you had hardware counters, maybe it returns them every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds. So I wondered whether, in addition to this being yes or no, it might be useful to have some way of saying what that rate is. Or do you think that's too complicated to do? Because that might be eventually just as useful as you'll only get the counters every 10 seconds.
Yes, that would be useful, but I think the basic problem will be, is it really implemented for that specific node, data node? I think that will be a much more common problem. And yeah, if you look at this meaningless small changes, which is one more reason, it was not my use case actually, but one more reason why not to implement it. This case you would say, okay, but if it changes fast, if the change is bigger than whatever, so it gets complicated fast. And smart filters might solve some of these issues, which was proposed earlier, that I send it, but only if I don't know, it's past the threshold, or if the change is faster than whatever.
Yep.
So I think smart filters is the better way to go for such more sophisticated cases.
Or another option could be to actually have a string that gets returned. So it could return, and then the device could say, just provide extra information as to what that granularity can be. So it doesn't help an automated device, but it does help if a user was looking at it. They could say, okay, fine, I need this data every 10 seconds.
I think you already have something similar in the negotiations for Yang push, where you could say that, okay, I refuse 1 second, but I propose 10 seconds for that. Wouldn't that be redoing that work in some way?
Maybe. I mean, I think open config one is you say it does it as frequently as it can. So you leave the device to choose.
I don't object to it, but I see that the main point is that is it implemented or not, really?
So Tim Carey, Nokia, I wanted to ask about the NMDA support, the on-change per data store, right? So I know in other organizations, we do have to differentiate whether it's an operational data store for certain elements, particularly like the enabled stuff, right? Yeah. You know, where you configure it to enabled versus disabled administratively, right? But then you have the operational status that can flap back and forth, right? And I might want an all change event for the administrative element of it, right? of that enabled, but not the operational element. And so is that what you were asking about? Because they would be the same element, just different stores.
I'm coming partly from the ITU 3GPP background, where you most commonly have an administrative state and the operational state as two separate leaves.
Right.
And that's sort
But now we've thump. Right?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't think it's the leaf that would be an operational, the enabled. I mean, it would still be operationally enabled. I mean,
Yeah, but the
administratively
point is
enabled.
that we have attributes, leaf nodes, right? That enabled is an example, right? Where it can go enabled, disabled, right? And it just, what they did is they grouped it together in a single leaf, right? And the data store is what provides the semantics around it. And some semantics that we care about, like whether it was administratively changed, do an on change for that, right? But you don't care about necessarily the operational status of it, for example, from the running, right? Because it's flapping back and forth, right? And you just don't, you got too much perturbation there. And so I'm just saying that we've seen those types of things in other management protocols where where they wanted to turn it on for one and not on the other, the on change, right? Particularly this is an active notification mechanism. And so I was wondering if that was the scenario that you were asking about, right? If people had seen.
That could be a use case if, let's say, if you think that is important that you configured it and you want to know when it.
But that was a scenario that you were requesting, right?
Yes.
That was the.
Do you think
that's
that's
what I
a
wanna make
valid
sure.
and important scenario to work on?
Yes, because I've seen management systems, depending upon who the consumer is, management systems care about one and not about the other.
Could be included.
Benoit Claes. So I would like to come back to the comment from the rate and Rob, etc. I think that you want to keep it simple. The draft solve a single problem, which is, I would like to have unchanged on all my objects in my router. Practically, it won't happen for various reasons. Just knowing if it's supported or not, it solves a great issue. And going into the rate and frequency of what you send, it's too complex already.
But would that mean that you don't want the per data store either?
I was not paying attention to that comment, sorry.
Okay.
Shivani from Photon Networks. So why this is not in the Yang push model?
Eric, will you?
It was in the Yang push model. It was taken out in a previous IETF where people wanted to simplify there and move it to its own draft. So Baulis had it in the previous Yang push model. People wanted to have it separate.
This is a integrated part of the push, right? So if I subscribe something, I need to know the status. But if you take it out, how does it work?
Yes.
But as I want Yang push to be pushed fast, so I'm happy with the current situation.
Okay, any other comments before we take a poll on whether we want this draft to be adopted as a work group item? Okay, if no, how many people have actually read this draft? Okay, a few. How many would support it being adopted as a work group item? Okay. Okay, quite a few more. Anybody who would object to it being adopted as a work group item? Okay. I guess then we'll take this to the mailing list.
Yeah, from the list. Jim? Where's Jim?
Hello, everyone. My name is Qin Wu.
I want to introduce this topic, an MDA-based event. This topic actually has been discussed in the last IETF meeting. Actually, we have two open issues we discussed. Actually, one is about how the event we propose in this draft relate to the young push, especially unchanged young push. The second is what change is needed to support an MDA. So after last IETF meeting, we worked together with my colleague Rocky and tried to resolve this open issue. We think actually has potential overlapping with young push. So we actually propose to replace the original event we put in the draft with NMDA data validation event. And another open issue, actually, we did actually talk with the original author of the RFC 6470 Netconf based event document, and whether we should actually make a bid for the RFC 6470 actually. Andy actually feedback to think actually it's better to keep a Netconf-based event as they are, and we should define new event specific to the NMDA. So also we respond to Tim Kelly from looking at the comments. Actually, we think right now the data store parameter only affect the Netconf config change event. So for other event, actually, there's no such data store parameter. So we solve these two open issue and we update this draft, and actually we rewrite the abstraction and the introduction and replace the original event we proposed with the new event NMDA data validation. So this is a use case for the NMDA data validation. We think actually there's quite a lot of background activity from the time the configuration has been committed into the running and to the time when the configuration is applied from the intent to the operational. So in some cases, actually, you may actually, some configuration cannot be applied to the operational because some misresults or validation failure. So in such cases, some for client actually demand to know, well, what is the validation result? What is the failure reason? So one typical use case is when you have validation have partial failure. So you need to know well, how many objects are really affected. So this is what we propose for the solution. Actually, we define a new event, common event specific to the NMDA. Actually, this event will be generated by the server who support the YARN-based protocol, actually, to detect the event that take place during the specific time period. As we mentioned about, actually, this actually will record the event and say the change of the data validation. And we think this common event doesn't need to be specific to the Netconf, but also can be applied to the RESTconf and other YARN-based protocol like gRPC. And we think we should inherit the management session parameter from original Netconf-based event draft. Actually, also we can actually allow the client to get access this event through various different subscription mechanisms. And so this is the example of the NMDA data validation. Actually, we can actually carry not only the management session parameter, such as username, session ID, source host, but also we can actually include some validation result like validation event and validation results. Actually, we support success, failure, and partial failure. In case of the failure or partial failure, we'll list actually a set of the objects that are being affected. So we think actually we resolve two open issues raised in the last meeting, and this draft actually has already been stable. We like to request working group to co-adoption for this draft. That's it.
Kent as a contributor. So, I mean, this is interesting, right? But where we have the configuration that's gone to running and then intended, but whether it's applied is the question. And its applicability, or it could be flapping. Someone could pull a line card, or there could be different reasons for why it's not been applied. So these notifications, this is a way to provide visibility to the application as to how much of the configuration or which parts of the configuration have not been applied. So this would happen asynchronously. Have you also thought about some sort of synchronous way to collect this information as well?
Right now, we haven't thought about it, but we can consider that. Yeah.
Seems like an important problem to solve.
Jason Stern, Nokia. I apologize, I haven't read the draft, but I'm just keying on what Kent said. Is this about determining that a data store became invalid, hence the word validation, or is this a notification saying, hey, something didn't get applied? Because the word validation in this made me think that some set of config is no longer valid. But what you're describing it as, and the example seemed to imply, hey, this leaf didn't get applied. Yeah, my understanding is the latter. So if it's the latter, I'm not sure validation is the right term.
It seems like a misnomer.
Yeah, maybe the notification should be called like something to, some NDA term, applied or didn't apply or something like that. Yeah. Good point.
So again, I think it's an important problem to solve. Probably would want to have some synchronous way of determining what parts have been applied as well. I mean, there's a data store diff, right? So if you do the diff between applied and operational, maybe that's another way of determining what hasn't been applied. So who in the room thinks this is an important problem to solve? Raise your hand, please. I'm the only one. Interesting.
No, I think that. No, so then, sorry.
Rob Wilton, Cisco. So the reason I'm not put my hand up is because I think you can get the same information by having a subscription notification on the configuration data store or the applied data store, and then you can monitor the applied configuration through notification back to what your config you're putting in is. So you can complete the circle using notification mechanisms asynchronously.
So you would still have to do a diff, I guess, between the two notifications?
I think you would continuously monitor the state, the operational state of the device, and you'd continuously rationalize that against the configuration you were putting in. So naturally, on a per data node level, you would be rationalizing whether or not that particular configuration is applied, rather than querying or... I'm not saying this notification is a bad thing. I'm just not quite sure whether it's necessary or not. I think it's okay.
I think one of the things we consider actually, we did consider actually there's a lot of state you need to monitor. So to really optimize this, actually, we only when you failure or partial failure will actually include the affected object. So we did actually model this in a young data model. Yeah.
And it may be that the failure case is more interesting to say it's not failed.
Yes.
But the other issue there is it could be hard on some systems to actually be able to provide this. Your system's asynchronous in terms of how things are being propagated through the system. You may not easily know if the state's ever reached, either successfully or as a failure, depending on how it's implemented.
Yeah.
Drew, how do you know, sorry, if I could step in. So how would you know when intended has finished applying all the changes to operational? When do you decide there was a fault and therefore it didn't get applied, or you're still waiting for the system to go through and actually apply the changes?
I think the server should know this, right?
How?
The server should know this, and
Jason Stern here, like if a line card's not plugged in, it doesn't get applied. So do you call that an error? Like sometimes it's hard to determine if something didn't get applied because of an error or versus just the requirements aren't there for the config to be able to be applied. Like it's not, like we talk about the classic example of when you configure an interface, but the line card's not plugged in, then that's not applied. That's not an error, right? We don't want to consider that an error. Sure, it's a difference between applied and intended, but would this thing call it an error?
I think we cover this because some case actually you may miss results. I think that's what you give the use case actually.
So I think it depends on the user putting the configuration in. They will know whether or not they're doing pre-config and hence whether or not it's an error. So if they're not doing pre-config, they may expect it to work and not fail. But if they are doing pre-config, then they would expect it to. And the system would struggle to know that.
But so I think the client, using what you're talking about, where it has a continuous view of the difference between applied and intended, it could determine that, oh, this case is bad. But we're talking about a notification here sent by the server, where the server decides that a case is bad.
Yeah.
I think we should take it to those. Yeah. Okay. So maybe one more comment.
So when we try to, this is different from water networks. So when we try to apply data store changes, we got like 100 failures. So the failures, 100 failures, the state will be saved somewhere? Must be, right? Otherwise, how can you query it? But I don't have any place to save those states.
I think this is not a defined query. The server will push the notification to the client. The client can actually locally save this kind of failure results, right? If he
there will be no central one single RPC to got all the failures. So we got the notification one by one. You got 100 notifications, or we bundle them together, got 10 notifications. Then it's up to the client to deal with them. So the normal notification will cover that. Why do we have separate RPC to query the failure?
Which normal notification you think can be used? I think this is actually not the RPC, not propose a new RPC. It's kind of notification, right? It's a generic notification, just like a Netconf base event. Actually, it's kind of general purpose notification.
So sorry, we are really running out of time on this. So I would suggest that maybe you take the discussion to the mailing list and we can then revisit the question of adoption. Okay. All right. You have 5 minutes for the second presentation.
Yeah. There's another draft is about the factory default setting capability for RESTconf, and I think it also applied to the Netconf. And the goal actually is allow the RESTconf client to configure the newly deployed device with pre-configured state during the, for example, zero-touch bootstrapping process. And also you can restore the configuration into the pre-configured initial state during the server restart or server fat error process. So motivation to do this, actually, we see a lot of limitation for the Netconf and the RESTconf. For example, for Netconf, actually, they have delete config, but they only actually can return the device to the factory default setting. It only applies to the startup, but it don't apply to the running. For the copy config operation, actually, you can use that operation actually to copy one data store to another data store, but without a factory data store as a source, you cannot return the target data store to the factory default setting. So also there's some limitation for the RESTconf. Similar reason actually, if RESTconf is implemented in the device that has Netconf server support, actually you may consider to use a copy config. You may actually face a similar issue. Actually, you copy one data store into another data store, but without the factory data store, you cannot return the target data store into the pre-configured initial state. So another case, actually, if the RESTconf is implemented in a device that doesn't have Netconf support, so the RESTconf client can actually be the NMDA data store aware. Actually, he can use HTTP put method as specified by the RFC 8040. And but the HTTP put method can only actually replace the entire contents with some configure split. Here we give the example. You cannot actually copy one data store into another data store use this kind of HTTP put. So this is a solution we proposed. We propose to define the factory data store. This factory data store can initialize the running into the factory default setting. Actually, if you only have the running, but if you have a running and stop both, actually, you can actually initialize both stop and running into the pre-configured initial state. In some cases, you really need a service restart, and so we want to point out actually there's some consistent issue. For example, you want to initialize the running into the factory, but at the same time, there's another operation like add config actually also add contents of alter the contents of the running. They may actually immediately update it to the stop, so they will cause the inconsistency between the stop and running.
Can you quickly wrap up?
Oh, okay. So we define this data store actually as a read-only data store actually, and we need to document the factory with the Netconf RESTconf operation, maybe restart operation together. But we actually face some before we document this kind of behavior, we also need to address the two open issues. One is actually, do we need to support this new operation like a factory restore? There's some discussion on the list actually. Some people favor actually using existing Netconf RESTconf operation. Maybe also need to consider restart operation. But we also have some argument to define the new operation. Actually, we see actually limitation of the RESTconf operation. Also, we need to support the general purpose operation. So you may need to define this kind of general purpose operation apply not only Netconf but also RESTconf and other YARN-based protocols. And in some cases, you need to server restart. In some cases, you don't need a server restart. If you have operation, you have a restart parameter to indicate whether restart is needed. So that's another case actually. Also, in the manifest, we discuss the difference between the system restart and the reboot. Actually, we think system restart actually, the difference between system restart and restart actually is for system restart, you need to restart the whole system, not limit to the Netconf. But restart is just you restart the server. So that's a big difference. And reboot is similar to the system restart. So the question actually whether if we believe actually existing RESTconf Netconf is sufficient and whether we need to define restart operation. So we think of the general agreement actually to define the factory data store and allow the device to validate. And but there's mixed opinion on whether we need to define new operation. That's it.
Sorry, we have to cut the presentation and move. We have only 8 minutes left for the last presentation.
Okay.
Hi, so it's Rob Wilton. I'm presenting on behalf of Lada because he missed his flight. So I'm not an author on this draft, but I have reviewed it and I've provided comments and links. So hopefully I'll do Lada some justice and useful to discuss. So first of all, what's this draft about? Really, he's called a transaction draft. But the way I think of it is introducing private candidate data stores so that you can have a candidate data store that is tied to your session. And he's done it in terms of RESTconf here, but you could also apply this to Netconf as well. So at the moment, in terms of what Netconf defines, it defines a candidate data store, but it's a bit ambiguous on this, but it's basically regarded as being a shared candidate data store and use locking to control it. What's been proposed here is a bit different. You have a candidate data store, which he's calling, somewhere, I can't remember, I've come to it, called something else, staging, I think, and in doing that, your particular session, you can write data to that, you can make multiple updates, and at some point you can commit the data. And as he says, it's an enhancement to 8040, contains backward compatibility and NMDA compliant. So that's probably some work there. So in terms of his implementation, he's using intended as the converging point between where these new private candidate data comes into. I think that's, in my opinion, probably a mistake. and you can read intended as being running. So actually, that's the point where you'd commit this configuration to. There's been some discussion on that on the alias, and I think he's agreed that probably he would change that. So I'll keep discussing in terms of intended, but everywhere you see intended, you can probably assume that's going to be running. In terms of the other thing that his draft talks about is reusing the same existing /data path, this sort of unified view that you have in RESTconf. I think there's some questions as to whether that's the right approach or not, but it's perfectly valid, and it allows it to work with pre-NMDA servers. But there's also another way of doing it, which would be to expose a staging data store directly, as the NMDA version of RESTconf supports. So in terms of the operations that are being added in here, your client, you get one of these staging data stores, you write data to it, and then when you decide to, you can then commit it, and it updates. Here it says intended. I think that's running. He also defines a reset operation, which then resets staging back to a current copy of intended or running. That allows you to do that. I think probably you also want to be able to diff what's in staging against intended or running. And we'd use the same diff operation that other people have already proposed. And the last thing I think that would probably be useful would be to be able to update staging to get a fresh copy against intended. So you keep your changes, you merge it in with what's currently in intended as well. And so our requirements here, the intended is always valid. That's the same thing applies to running as well. So in his current draft, he hasn't defined a merge procedure. He's left that undefined. Because he says there's different use cases. I suspect that's something that would have to be specified as this goes forward, in my opinion. In terms of compatibility, this is where he's saying in terms of using staging effectively, there'd be no change to the user. By using the existing /data path, you wouldn't have any changes. I suspect that you might have to have some sort of negotiation first to know that this is going on beforehand. Yeah, so I think there's some tweaks maybe here. Naming issues, so some discussion as to whether it should be called staging or candidate of this new data store. I would support calling it something different because I think it's valid potentially to expose candidate through RESTconf. So giving it a new name is better. There's been discussion in the alias between whether it should be intended or running, as I've just mentioned. I think that would change to updating running. I think that's okay. And then, okay, fine, he gives some examples. He got running code in terms of his JetConf implementation written in Python 3. So there's running code to be supported here. Really, I think this is an interesting problem, though. Do we try and solve this in the working group? Do we actually have this idea of private candidate data stores? So I think that's, to me, is the most useful question that maybe is worth asking in the room. Is this sort of thing a good idea?
So, agree.
Yeah, so I personally, as a contributor, agree that it's a problem, but trying to solve. But let's poll the working group to see is their interest in, do they think that it's a valid problem that we should be solving?
So I'm sort of
show of hands.
Raise your hand if you think this is an interesting problem to solve.
Okay.
And if you don't think this is an important problem to solve, raise your hand. Well, okay. One hand.
I feel like it's an important problem to solve, but whether use the separate data store or not, it's questionable.
Yeah, as a contributor, I also think this is an important problem to solve. In fact, I think it's a very important problem to solve. This is the key difference between RESTconf and Netconf, right? The reason why RESTconf hasn't been able to eclipse Netconf yet is because of the lack of transactions and support for things like confirm commit. If this brings that in, then it would make RESTconf an equal player in the protocol space. So I highly support this.
Yeah, but I also think that the implementation of individual candidate data stores has been pretty much left undefined. Some have chosen to implement it as a private candidate. Others have done a locking mechanism to try to use candidate. So maybe some specification around what is a candidate data store and whether it's staging is that data store would be helpful to solve.
So one last comment on a counterpoint to this is I know that some operators say this is not required. And their justification is that if you can generate the entire change set in your client and then just send it down as an atomic operation. And hence you don't need this sort of persistent behavior. But that's one operator's view.
Okay, so I think we should confirm this adoption poll on the list.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for presenting, Perlato. And that's a wrap. We've gone through everything. We 1 minute to spare. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Oh, blue sheets. Somebody has the second pad of blue sheets.
Awesome.